Hello, everybody. I'm David Medeiros. I'm the GIS Reference and Instruction Specialist at the Stanford Geospatial Center. And today we're going to be talking about cartography or map design in GIS. Hopefully this will be about a 20 or 30 minute slide lecture. We'll see. Giving a 20-minute talk on all of cartography is a bit like giving a 20-minute talk on the history of Western civilization. I don't think you can do it in 20 minutes. So we're not really going to cover cartography as a broad concept. Instead, we're going to talk more about specific best practices and topics in map design for GIS maps in general. And hopefully this will give you some understanding of how design affects maps and map communication, and also some tools to use to just make better maps in general, without having to really be cartographers or dive deep into the background of cartography as a discipline. So what is a map? Maps are representations, documents that use symbols and illustrations to depict or represent the real world. Maps are also a form of visual communications. We use maps to hold and transmit spatial information. Maps have an enormous potential data density. So the data density of something like a typical phone book is about 36,000 characters or bits per two-page spread. A detailed reference map, something like a detailed street map, has a data density of about 100,000 to 150,000 bits per square inch. A USGS topographic quad can hold as much as 250,000 bits per square inch. So maps are very, very potentially data-rich, data-dense documents. You can put a lot of information into a map. Maps use processes like abstraction, simplification, and aggregation to help make all of this complex data legible. And that's basically what we accomplish through design. Those are kind of the main tools of design with maps to make maps work as effective communication documents. Okay, so what is design? What does it mean to design something? In this case, design is not about an aesthetic process, but a decision-making process. We're all designers. We make decisions to design outcomes for our everyday lives all the time. You wake up hungry in the morning, we go to the cupboard, we get down a bowl, grab a spoon, pull out the cereal, get some milk, put it all together and eat it, and suddenly you're not hungry anymore by design. And that's really all we mean by design in this context. Design is about making decisions to affect certain kinds of outcomes. In cartography, the outcome we're designing for is a map that's legible and communicates effectively with our audience. Not all forms of communication are equal in terms of effectiveness. The guy standing outside Trader Joe's in his socks ranting about the end of the world has a pretty bad communication design, in my opinion. On the other hand, something like Nat Geo or the Washington Post has my full attention when I read a well-designed story on, say, the coming age of mega fires in the West. Default and arbitrary styles are kind of the norm in GIS mapmaking unless you apply a design or decision-making process to what you're doing in your GIS projects. Arbitrary styling can affect the meaning of what you're trying to say. As you can see here, you'll always be mine, or you'll always be mine. Default design is, again, that's kind of the standard with GIS mapmaking because it's easy, and if you don't understand what you're doing or how to make changes, then you tend to just not make changes. The problem with defaults is they don't understand what you're doing. Default is a default, and default design can make one piece of work or one piece of data indistinguishable from something else in your map or other parts of your project, and that can lead to confusion and break down the communication flow that you're trying to create. It's important to understand that when we're creating maps in GIS, especially when we're creating maps at sort of, at the end stage of a GIS project or at stops throughout a project where what we're trying to do is communicate something out of the project to other people, not just doing analysis work for ourselves, it's important to understand that those maps are part of a communication process, a visual communication process or a map communication process. We have information that we know that we want to share out to our stakeholders, to the map readers. And the map is the thing that stands in between our message and the people who we want to give the message to. It's the window that we're passing all that information through, and how that map is designed is going to affect, obviously, what message that person gets, how well they're interpreting the information we want to send over to them. So there is a map communication process in GIS map making. You have to be aware of that. The concepts here are that good design enhances effective communication and poor design diminishes effective communication. So maps that are clear, legible, simple to understand, and designed for their purpose and audience are going to be more effective than maps that are not. What do we risk when we don't take the time to communicate effectively? Communication breakdown. Poor quality cartography can obscure the point of your work and send misleading or incorrect messages to the map reader. Perception of visual quality. So visual design quality can directly affect the perception of work quality in your project. Poorly designed visuals may suggest poorly designed analysis. Capturing attention. Project visuals may be the best chance you have to engage with your audience. A lot of people will flip through lengthy documents, but they'll stop on the visuals, especially if they're attention grabbing. And finally, engaged thinking. To look at a well-designed map is to think about its content and not just observe it. So a couple of quick examples of why design matters. Here's a couple of maps of the state of Hawaii, my home state. And they're both kind of showing us similar pieces of information, but they're doing it in really different ways, right? Good design usually involves making complex data more legible and easily understood. And this mostly involves things like simplifying and cleaning up layout. So a lot of GIS maps will be really data heavy. There's going to be lots of different features and lots of colors, because every time you add something to a map, you get a new color as the default color. And we tend not to change those things very much. We kind of tend to leave in all of our analysis layers, even when we're producing a map to send out to someone else. But it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to take those messy analysis maps and clean them up a little bit and make a map that is publication ready, that really looks like something that you'd put into a magazine. And although this looks like the map on the top left of Hawaii probably took a lot more effort and a lot of graphic design know-how and that sort of thing to produce, it really doesn't. It takes mostly just knowing to get rid of stuff that you don't need to have in the map. So removing a lot of these. There's a bunch of bathymetric layers in this map in the lower right that don't really need to be there to help us understand the layout of the islands and the age of the islands, their distribution of age going from the southeast to the northwest, right? That's the point of this map, is to show you progression of the island chain and the age increase sort of in this linear motion across the chain. And that's more easily understood in this map in the top left. Really all it's done is simplify the symbology, taken away lines for islands and just filled them as black silhouettes or just simple dots within a nice blue background, simplified labels, spaced labeling out a little bit better, and got rid of this inset frame and that sort of stuff. It's really just about minimally moving things around, getting rid of things that don't need to be there, reducing visual interruption as much as possible, and simplifying colors and styles and that sort of thing. Design also lets us tailor maps to specific audiences. So in this example here, it's similar to what was going on with the Hawaii map. We've taken a lot of the complex data out of the ocean currents map in the top left and really simplified it into this map that you see in the bottom right. But it's about more than that. There's not really anything inherently wrong with the map in the top left. I think it's really beautiful, actually. It's a really rich, data-rich, complex map of global ocean currents. The real key here is that these two maps sort of accomplish the same goal, but for different people. So the map in the top left is one that's more usable by specialists and someone who's familiar with the data that they're looking at. The map in the bottom right is one that's going to be more familiar or easier to parse for someone who's not as familiar with the scientific background to whatever the topic is that you're working on. And so the bottom map is the big picture, and the top map is sort of the specialist's view with all of the complex data that they can parse through with their own knowledge and skill set. And just in case you're thinking that this kind of stuff doesn't really matter, the people who look at your maps and grade your reports and all that sort of stuff will forgive you for not spending any time on design or making sure that you're paying attention to the details in your map. I present you the hog map, which looks like a perfectly fine geospatial kind of a map. Bunch of states, the United States, lined up with dots representing 5,000 hogs per dot on a really clean, simple looking black background. And I'll let you read through the comments people are being tongue in cheek here. Obviously the map is understandable, but design matters, and little details like this are going to lead to, if nothing else, distraction. So pay attention to how you make your maps. So like I said at the beginning, there's a lot of ground to cover when it comes to the broad body of knowledge and concepts that is cartography. So we're just going to hit a few things here that affect how we make maps and how we can make better maps in GIS. And so this is kind of the short list of things that I think are the most important to pay attention to. The first is map intentions. And that means what is our intention with the map? So what is our map about? Who is it for? And how will it be seen? This affects everything else that comes after it, right? You need to know your data, what you're communicating, who you're communicating to. Are they specialists? Are they laymen? What's their interest in what you're talking to them about? And then how will they view the map? Is this map going to be printed in a journal, in a book? Are you going to print it out, on a sheet of paper and just hand it in with a regular project, or is it going to be shown on a website or on a huge screen at a conference, right? All these different modes of communication affect how you design the map. The next is intellectual and visual hierarchies. So what information is important to your map's goals, to the map's intentions, and how will you represent that importance visually? So how do you make someone see in your map what is the message and what's important and what's not important? And that's broken out into what's called the intellectual and visual hierarchies. And generalization and classification. So how are you going to modify your map's representations? How are you going to change the marks and symbols on your map to suit its purpose? And we'll talk about how you do that as well. Map symbology, this is kind of related to the generalization and classification. So how do you change those marks to attach meaning to the symbols that go into your map? Type or labels on maps. Labels make the map. You can have a map of only labels, and there are a lot of them. If you go and do a quick Google search of like typology maps or label maps, you can find quite a few maps that are decent maps and communicate some, I think specific locational information with nothing but labels. So type on a map is really important, and it's also one of the hardest things to do in a GIS, but it's worth spending a little bit of time on to improve the way default labels appear on your map. Color on maps, and this is probably what we'll spend the most time talking about in the next couple of minutes. Color on maps is really hard. Color has meaning, and color is really easy to misuse when it comes to cartography and GIS maps. And then, finally, map layout. The visual flow of your map, the spacing of elements in the map, focus, balance, all this sort of stuff. It sounds very artsy. This is, if you do any photography, this would be sort of similar to just how you compose an image. All of this stuff affects how legible the map is in the end, and it's not that hard to do. You just spend a few extra minutes in the layout tools in something like ArcGIS or QGIS to move things around and get things lined up so that everything is neat and tidy and you have the same amount of space on one side of a box or a set of labels as you do on the other, and that sort of thing. And it really helps a map kind of go from something that you just made in a GIS to something that you really designed for publication. So of all of those concepts, none is probably more important than the concept of visual hierarchy, and then implied in that is an intellectual hierarchy. So you have an intellectual hierarchy. This is what's important to me. This stuff is sort of contextual, and this stuff is background information. And once you have an intellectual hierarchy, you can design a visual hierarchy to match it. So you design the map to visually match your interpretation of the importance of the different elements in the map. And you do that by anything that sort of changes the way things look to help create visual distance between features in the map. So if you look at what we're seeing over here on the left, we've got these different, color graded symbols or grayscale symbols in the map frame. And down here is sort of a representation of their height in the visual hierarchy. So a visual hierarchy is this imaginary depth in an image from background to foreground. If you think about any painting or any photograph, you intuitively understand what is the back of the image, what's in the background, and what's in the middle ground, and what's in the foreground. And that's not just because you can interpret distance through images, but it's also because colors and focus and saturation and placement play a role in how your brain interprets whether something is at the front of the image or at the back of the image. And so you do things in map design to change the color and the placement and the density to affect this hierarchy, this placement of features in the map from the background to the foreground. If you look at the map on the right, this is a typical sort of straight out of the defaults GIS map. Everything gets the same kind of basic styling. Nothing is really given any contrast or anything else, and it's really hard to differentiate the meaning of different features and lines and labels. Everything is basically on the same visual hierarchy. So this is a map that's basically flat. It tells us nothing about where to look first or what's most important or what we should read and what information we should take away from the map. If you make a quick adjustment to the styles, you get rid of line casings and you use only shading to fill the background for the terrain. You only use really dark black, solid black for the most important parts of the document, the labels and the points. Suddenly they float to the top of the visual hierarchy. They're on the top, they're most important. In the middle ground are these somewhat darker gray lines for things like the lake and the roads and the town outline and that sort of stuff. And so if I flip back and forth here a little bit, I think you can kind of get the idea, right, of taking some really small changes to the style for the symbols in your map creates depth where there wasn't any depth before. And so we push to the top of the visual hierarchy things that are more important to us, and we push to the background parts of the map that are contextual or are just supporting. They're the base information or they're other data that support the more important data. The key to visual hierarchy is just anything that you can do to create contrast and visual separation will enhance the visual hierarchy. Simplicity. Great design tends towards simplicity. Jacques Bertin. I think if you spend a second looking at this map, you can probably guess what it is, or at least sort of what it represents. If you look closely, I think first thing it will hit you is that it's a map, right? It's the world. If you look around, you start to see the shapes of the continents, even though there's really not a lot of data here. You can see South America, you can see Africa and Asia, and India is really quite clear, that sort of stuff. And if you kind of have a mental picture of what the world looks like, you can start to superimpose it on top of this. If you spend a little more time with this, I think you might be able to figure out what exactly is being represented here, even though we're not being told, we're just being shown a single piece of information. This is a single data set of one phenomena. I'll spoil it for you if you haven't figured it out already. This is a global population map. So this is everywhere in the world where there is more than 100 people per square kilometer, I think. I forget the exact number, but it's a map by William Bunge called The Islands and Continents of Man. And so this is a map stripped away of everything except for its singular piece of data. And it is still a map. It's just the data alone creates the map. And this is a really extreme example of simplicity, but it's to highlight the idea that a lot of what goes into maps is unnecessary in order for you to communicate your information to someone else. And so if you pay close attention to how you design your data and look at the things that are in the map that are not directly linked to the message or not required for people to understand the context of your message, then you can probably get rid of a lot of that stuff. The other side to this is that you need to be careful of taking away contextual information from your maps that create something called the island effect. It's really easy to make a map in GIS that doesn't have supporting information around the boundaries of something you're trying to show people. And if the audience isn't familiar with the territory you're talking about, so if we're not talking about a global scene, but we're looking at just a single county, maybe somewhere in the US, and you're talking to people who aren't from that county, the data may end up looking isolated and unfamiliar if you don't put more information into it to help people understand where you're talking about. So there's a trade-off here. You need to be careful of oversimplifying maps. But in general, you can do a lot better by getting rid of things that don't need to be in your map. So always keep simplicity in mind when making a map. The visual variables can be thought of as a guide to how we manipulate or change our symbols in a map to best represent the kind of data that the symbols are standing in for. And the main differences in terms of the data are between qualitative and quantitative. So data that it's about different kinds of things versus data that has different amounts of values. In GIS, we mostly look at changing the shape, size, color hue, or color value of our symbols. Shape and size are morphology changes. Different shapes help us distinguish between different qualitative aspects of data, so different kinds of features in the map. Shape size is a way to represent value, so bigger and smaller means more or less. Color hue, again, is qualitative. Different colors mean something is different in a qualitative sense. And color value, usually a light to dark of a single color, is another way of showing different values for the data. Color intensity and color texture aren't used that much in most mapping, so we stick mostly to these first four: shape, size, color, hue, and color value. And the main thing here is to sort of look at the symbol that we're looking at, whether it's points, lines, or areas, and whether we can use a change in shape, size, color, hue, or color value to make a meaningful change in the design of the symbol for the map. And the main thing we're looking at when we do that is the data we're trying to represent showing us a qualitative information, changes in types of things throughout the map, or quantitative? Do we have values or categorical, classification changes and that sort of thing? And so the visual variables is just a quick way to reference those changes, and they get used throughout the mapping process and design as we go in and make changes to the way symbols, lines, points, areas are represented in the map document. Okay, color. What is it good for? Everybody got your seatbelts on? Time to buckle up. This is the home stretch here, but it's probably the densest part of all of this. Color is by far the most complicated topic when it comes to map making. There's so much confusion about how color is used, what it means. There's so many pitfalls about things like color blindness and color intention or cultural meanings of color and that sort of stuff, that this can be a really, really easy to misuse and abuse form of design in map making. So hopefully I'll get you guys straightened out here by the end of this. If not, this is the kind of thing you can always come and talk to me about when you're working on projects in your class later. All right, first up is something we just talked about in the visual variables, and that's this idea of making sure that you match the visual variable to the kind of data you're displaying. So color hue or color value. Different colors mean these are different things. They're not worth more or less than each other. Is red worth more than blue or green or yellow? If so, why? And color value, being what we should use when we want to talk about things being more or less. And color value usually meaning a single color with a ramp going from light to dark of that color. The single color tells us this is the same thing, and the light to dark tells us we've got more or less depending on what shade it is. Here at the top right, you can see this NREL map if you look at it really closely. So this is biomass resources of the United States. If you don't know anything about what they're talking about initially, you think that we're looking at a map of different things all over the country. But down in the legend, you can see it's really value-based. It's estimates of dry tons per year of biomass resources. So from under 250 tons per year to greater than 5,000 tons per year. So this is a linear scale of values, but it's being mapped as colors. Red is the most, blue is a little less, green then yellow, right? So this is a really bad mapping of the visual variable to the data intent, or what the data means. NREL, for some reason, is really bad at this. Go look up NREL maps and you'll see that almost all their maps are like this, and I don't know why. They're catchy, they grab your attention because they're really bright and colorful, and they've got a nice deep drop shadow and all this other stuff. They're generally well-made maps, so they've got someone who kind of knows what they're doing in terms of design, but they're missing this one thing here, and I think it may be that they're doing it on purpose to grab your attention, which is something that happens in GIS maps a lot. We make big, bright maps to grab attention, and that's not a good thing. You want your data to be really attention-grabbing, and it's better to push all of the rest of the design in your map to the background by using less colorful design and subtler design, and that way your data doesn't need a lot of brightness to be eye-catching. But more importantly, match the kind of color system you use to what the data means. Color hues for qualitative data, color value for quantitative data. Okay, so matching the visual variable with the type of data that you're representing with color is the first kind of big color topic. Then I kind of implied the second one already, which is make sure you're not overdoing color in a GIS. And again, that's really easy to do. So even if you match your color style, your color scheme to the kind of data you're doing, GIS tends to err on the side of these bright, bold, really in-your-face colors, and I don't know what that stems from. The defaults kind of do it for you. I also think people tend to gravitate towards those colors because they're looking at it on a screen and it's eye-catching or whatever the case may be. That it's just easier, or it seems like it's the right thing to do, I guess, to use these big, bold, bright colors, big, dark, heavy lines, and big, fat symbols and that sort of stuff. But then the net result is when you put all of this together into a map that has a lot of different things going on, and they're all sort of overdone, and they're very heavy-handed and bright, the map is about as friendly as a punch in the face. It's much better to kind of err on the side of subtlety. Nature's colors tend to be a lot more familiar and consistent. Using natural colors for one thing is great because there are a lot of colors in nature that we already have a lot of, at least, you have to kind of watch out for different cultural associations. But depending on who you're talking to, you may know the association with certain colors already. Cool and warm colors that represent water or heat or solid structures, that sort of thing, leaves, foliage, whatever. There are natural mappings between certain colors and certain features or phenomena, and you can make use of that in your maps to kind of lead the viewer directly into understanding what the data represents. And then beyond that, just subdued natural colors are a lot easier to parse and understand visually, as I think these two maps demonstrate. These are exactly the same data. These are radio towers that display, I think, the reach, like the kilowatt power reach of all these different radio station towers. And if you look at the map in the upper left, and you focus in on where is the heaviest, densest, what you would assume is the most important data because it sits on the top of the visual hierarchy, are these big, dark, red and brownish areas out in the desert west. That's actually the lowest value data in the map. And if you look at the map on the bottom right, you can see that they've used that. You kind of flip that color scale. The cool colors mean that's sort of the farthest reach of the data, and the heavy, darker brown colors are where the heavy concentrations are. And that same area that's in the upper left that where misidentifying is the most important, is just void in the map on the bottom right. So they didn't even map it because there's really nothing going on there, and that's another example of important design changes to make. Is cut your data off from being represented when it's no longer of any importance to what you're talking about. So nature's colors are kind of a better way to go. Subtlety in general, and again, I think I said it just a few minutes ago with the last slide, but the more you subdue things and sort of push the color scale to the background, the more room you have in the visual hierarchy to have a few simple marks stand out a lot more prominently by applying just a little extra color or saturation to them, and then not having to overdo it. Okay, repeat after me. Rainbows are for unicorns. I apologize in advance if you like rainbows and unicorns, that's fine. This is about the use of the rainbow color spectrum, in particular in science mapping, heavy scientific mapping. This is a really common color ramp that you're going to see with scientific documents, scientific mapping, and the excuse or the reason usually is my data is so sciencey and it has so many numbers in it, I need as many colors as possible to be able to convey all this information. And so we get people grabbing this really color-rich ramp to help you sort of feel like their data is really very important. The problem is that this is a really difficult color system to read real data values from, and in particular with science mapping, we're trying to convey specific values or broad pictures of high and low, complex mapping high and low values to the map reader. And when you look at the rainbow color scheme, what you see is that it's not perceptually linear, which means that as you scan across the rainbow from left to right, you'll find these bands of really bright colors. And if you convert it to grayscale, it's even easier to see that there are prominent high brightness ranges within the color ramp that are not at the ends. They're sort of distributed around the middle somewhere. And we tend to perceive those high, bright areas as high values. And that means that the ramp isn't linear, right? It has more than one high value peak, for one thing. And it's not in the right place, so the peaks don't appear where we would assume the high or low values are. Also, a lot of colors repeat on either side of these values. There are light greens on both sides of the dark green middle. There's similar light blue values and similar values for yellow that might mean one value and another value at the same time, so that there's not a very easy direct mapping of values to the color. It is much better in mapping like this to use a linear color ramp, so something that goes in one color from a low to a high value, the value of the color representing the value of the actual data in the map. It is possible to have perceptually linear color ramps that actually are technically more than one color. If you look at the examples here at the bottom, this actually goes from a yellow to a light green to kind of a darker green to a light blue to a dark blue. So there's multiple colors spread throughout here. But these are colors that work together and still maintain a linear ramp, and they are all still perceptually linear. So you have light on one side going to dark on the other, and wherever you are in that lightness band is gonna relate to what value you're looking at in the map, high or low values. So be very, very careful of the rainbow color scheme. If you get a instructor who demands that you use it because this is the way science is done with horrible rainbow colors, just you can feel free to put them in contact with me, and I will attempt to dissuade them of the value of the rainbow color scheme. Okay, that's it. That's the meat and bones of map design in GIS. I'm guessing this was a lot longer than 20 minutes. Oh, I apologize for that. On this last slide is just some sort of like quick tips. I call this sort of the like eat your veggies for map making. This is if you only have 10 minutes to do some design on your map, this is your little checklist. And these few things will help a lot in just cleaning up. It really takes very little to change sort of the the rubbish that you can kind of just get as defaults from a GIS and make it look significantly better by just making a few small changes or checks. Things like map titles, make sure they're brief and that the title says something related to what the map is really about. Check your map scales, make sure that your scales are correct. It's really easy to get misleading scale bars put into a map. Things like units are rounded, so nobody wants to see a 1 to 4.85 kilometer scale. Round off your values a little bit. Do legend symbols match the map? So that's the visual variable stuff. Do symbol classifications match the data type? Again, that's variables, hues versus values for colors and that sort of thing. Can anything be removed or simplified? Look at all the layers you put into your map and throw out anything that really isn't part of the message or the context. Does your map include a title, a source, and author information? So if this map is going somewhere that's going to be published, or it may ever end up separated from the rest of the project that you've produced it from, make sure it says who made it and what it's about and when it was made and what it was made from. Will the map fit the page or the screen or wherever it's going? So make sure that you're making a map that fits the space it's going into. Don't just make a one-size-fits-all map and then blow it up or shrink it down. You'll always get bad results that way. Does the map reproduce okay in black and white? Take your color map, print it in black and white, or view it in black and white on screen, and take a look at it and see what it looks like. And also review it for color blindness. There's websites where you can take an image, put them up, and it'll convert it to like, this is what it will look like for particular kinds of color blindness. And then you can make changes in your colors to make sure that even if a colorblind person views your map, they're going to see the same differences. They're still going to see the changes in values and be able to distinguish one symbol from another. Check your spelling. I'm horrible at this. There's nothing worse than having a really well-made map have spelling errors on it. It impacts the validity of the map or the perception of its validity significantly. Have someone review it. When you're all done with it, you'll have, if you spend a lot of time making a map, you get what's sort of like map maker's eye. You can't see the things that you're changing anymore. You perceive everything as correct, and your mind is making these edits for you, but there's really a lot of errors still on it. So have someone else look at it who's not familiar with it, and then proof it in its final media. So that's the same as kind of, will it fit the page or screen? Make sure that you see it how you intend it to be viewed, so that you know exactly what your audience is going to get when you put the map out there. So that's it. That's the minimal map making advice for GIS students. I've given Stace some links to some reading for map design, and there's a lot more content and reading on my website that I use as sort of like a landing page for links, resources, and fun things in map making and GIS. It's bit.ly GIS Cart, GISCART. I'll send the link through Stace so you guys can link to it. These slides will be up there, as well as a whole bunch of other content. And of course, you can always send me an email and get in touch with me directly as you start working on maps and you want to talk about map design and that sort of stuff. I'm always happy to help, and there's a lot more. If you have ideas that sound too complex, just come talk to me. There's a lot of really cool stuff you can do, and I play around with a lot of it, and so I'm sure we can find some way of helping you put some of this stuff together. Okay, that's it. Good luck.